Pam Fox at pamfox.org. Thank you for joining me tonight. In this video, I'm going to be sharing session 1 of my e-course, Reversing Hiatal Hernia Naturally. And the first session in my course is all about anatomy, and the reason it's so important to understand your anatomy when it comes to understanding your condition is because when it comes to a hiatal hernia, it's the actual hernia itself and the pressures that it creates within your anatomy is why you have the symptoms you have. And so instead of trying to manage or treat different symptoms, which is why I come on here and I teach, is because we've just been so, I don't know, just trained to, we're sick and we have a symptom and we just treat that symptom. But what I'm offering is an alternative, and that is that when it comes to hiatal hernia, if we remove the hiatal hernia, we remove the symptoms. And so that is where, in my opinion, our focus needs to be. It needs to be in actually removing the hiatal hernia. And that's why a person with a hiatal hernia will have a hiatal hernia surgical repair, is to eliminate the symptoms that they're experiencing, right? So in order to eliminate our symptoms, we need to eliminate our hiatal hernia. And so it's so very important then to begin with understanding your anatomy. And so that's what I teach in this course. I hope that you'll find it helpful. If you want to learn more about me, you can go to the About Me tab on my website, pamfox.org. My credentials are there, but I am not a doctor. I am a holistic health coach, and I help people who want to heal in natural and effective ways. And I suffered for years with a hiatal hernia, and that's why I developed this course once I was able to come up with a protocol that actually worked, that naturally and effectively reversed my hiatal hernia so that I could overcome my symptoms and become medication free and no need for surgery. Then I went on to go ahead and create this e-course with all of the information in one place at what I consider a very affordable rate. So you can check that out at pamfox.org, but I'm going to go ahead and share the entire first session in tonight's live. So let's get started. In my course there are notes that you can download. It's just a PDF that you can follow along and take your own notes while you're taking the course. So session 1 is called Anatomy and Understanding Your Symptoms, and I start out teaching about the lower esophageal sphincter, and I'm going to refer to the lower esophageal sphincter as the LES. And all that is basically is a valve where your esophagus connects with your stomach. So if this is your esophagus and your stomach, there's a valve where the two connect, known as the lower esophageal sphincter, or the LES. And its job, it will dilate and open when we swallow food, when the food comes down the esophagus, so that it can enter into the stomach. So its job is to dilate and open and allow that food in. But its other job is to clamp down tight so that nothing can exit the stomach, right? So I kind of think of the LES as kind of like a gatekeeper or a gate guard. It will allow that food in, but it's not supposed to allow the food out. So there are some exceptions. So one, if there's a gas buildup in the stomach, it will dilate and open up to release that gas in the form of a belch. If we are poisoned, it will that valve will dilate and open up to release that poison in the form of vomit. And then if we have reflux, that valve doesn't clamp down tight and the acid can reflux upward into the esophagus. So that's the LES. And so then the question then becomes, well then why is it then with hiatal hernia, then why do I have the symptoms that I have, such as heartburn or indigestion or nausea or belching? Why is that valve not working effectively? Why is it compromised? And so there's a couple of things that I talk about in this anatomy course in terms of pressure. So there's internal pressure and there's external pressure. So first of all, with internal pressure would just be obviously like bloating. So within the stomach, if you have bloating, that's going to create pressure, and it's going to put pressure on the lower esophageal sphincter. And then inflammation within the stomach. So if you have, any diagnosis of any, digestive disorder like gastritis or Crohn's disease, IBS, IBD, there's a long list, then you most likely have inflammation of the digestive tract. If you have any of those digestive conditions, you have inflammation of the digestive tract. And so if your lower esophageal sphincter is inflamed as well, when we think of something being inflamed, what is it? It's red, it's tender, it's irritated, it's swollen, okay? And so anytime something is red and tender and irritated and swollen, that's going to compromise its function, right? It's going to compromise its function. And the same is true with the LES. So if there's swelling at the LES, then it's not going to be able to clamp down really effectively and keep the contents in the stomach, okay? So those are a couple examples of internal pressure. And then moving on to external pressure. So things like constipation, which is a really kind of main contributor to causing hiatal hernias, is ongoing long-term constipation, because when a person has to bear down to pass a bowel movement, they contract or pull in their stomach muscles, and this puts pressure on the stomach. It actually pushes the stomach up. It pushes it up against the diaphragm when you bear down to pass a bowel movement. And so that's an example of external pressure put on the stomach, which in turn then puts pressure on that lower esophageal sphincter. If the stomach is being, I keep this little balloon handy for demonstration purposes, but if the stomach is being pressed up against the diaphragm, and that valve is right there where the esophagus, connects with the stomach, where the two meet is the valve, and now that's being pressed against the diaphragm, that can put pressure on that lower esophageal sphincter as well. So also overcrowding within the abdominal cavity. So some examples of overcrowding would be if you're backed up, again, going back to constipation. So, maybe you haven't passed a bowel movement for several days and the food is backed up. That can cause overcrowding, which again will push that stomach up. If you have, tumors or growths within the abdominal cavity, that can cause overcrowding and push on the stomach. If you are overweight, and this is one of the most common forms of overcrowding, would be being overweight, especially if you're obese, creates overcrowding within the abdominal cavity and pushes that stomach up. Within your abdominal cavity, there's an organ known as the omentum, and it's an actual organ, but it's a sheet of fat, which does have vital functionality within the body. But in a lean person, it's a thin, small sheet of fat, and in an obese person, it's a very large sheet of fat. So it can create, again, that overcrowding within the abdominal cavity and push that stomach again up against the diaphragm. So those are some examples of external pressure that will put pressure on that lower esophageal sphincter and push it up against the diaphragm, or in the case of hiatal hernia, through the diaphragm. And then what we need to keep in mind is, so if this is your diaphragm, and I'm just pretending like my stomach is pushing up into the diaphragm. So now this little guy up here is actually your stomach above your diaphragm, which means now, up here in the diaphragm, you have the heart and the lungs. And so that LES can be pressed against the heart, it can be pressed against the lungs. So with a hiatal hernia, or even what I call a pre-hiatal hernia, you have all of these different options or different variations of pressure or potential pressure being put on the lower esophageal sphincter, okay? Which then can create, so I've got a list of just possible symptoms. And many of you can relate to many of these. Some of the most popular ones are indigestion and heartburn. Again, maybe with indigestion, you're just getting a little bit of irritation of the lower esophageal sphincter, or maybe just a little bit of acid rising up. And then with heartburn, you're getting enough acid to rise up and actually burn the esophagus and create that pain. Sore throat and hoarseness, that's where the acid may be rising up a little bit higher. And this is something, we have two conditions. We have GERD, gastric esophageal reflux disorder, and then we have LPR, which is laryngopharyngeal reflux, which is where the larynx and the pharynx meet. There's another one-way valve up there. Same thing as the lower esophageal sphincter, it's the upper esophageal sphincter. But what we have to keep in mind, a lot of times in the support groups that I belong to for GERD and LPR, I constantly hear people desperate in wanting to treat the symptoms, say, for example, sore throat and hoarseness. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with treating those symptoms. Go ahead and take those supplements that give you relief and that protect the tissues. But we also need to, again, we need to get to the root. So if the acid is making its way past the upper esophageal sphincter, it's got to make its way past the lower esophageal sphincter first, right? So that's where we need to place our mindset, and it's where we need to, and our focus is on reversing that hiatal hernia so that there are no pressures on that lower esophageal sphincter so that the acid reflux can't occur in the first place. Okay, so just moving on with some of the possible symptoms: sore throat and hoarseness, persistent cough. Again, the acid is getting up and irritating the upper portion of the throat, causing you to clear your throat all the time. Belching. So do I talk about, yeah, so belching, I skipped it. I see that I skipped it, so I'm going to go back. So going back to external pressure, when your stomach, when a portion of your stomach is up here above the diaphragm in the chest cavity, that portion of your stomach is now under the same law known as Boyles Law that applies to your lungs when we breathe. And what that means, and I did a whole video on this just maybe about a week ago. You can go back and watch me go more into depth. But just to summarize, Boyles Law says that when there is low volume, there is high pressure. And so what that means when we think about breathing is that when the diaphragm moves down, it creates more space within the chest cavity, which means there's low pressure. And then when the diaphragm moves up, and I just got that backwards. When the diaphragm moves up, the lungs deflate, and that creates more space and low pressure. Am I getting this backwards? When the lungs expand, okay, there's less space, which creates less space, which means low volume, which means high pressure, and it's that high pressure that causes the lungs to deflate and pushes and causes all the air to push out back into the atmosphere. And so what does this have to do with the hiatal hernia? Well, that same Boyles Law will apply to your little bit of stomach that's now up in the chest cavity. And so then what can happen is air can get trapped in the esophagus and in the stomach and repetitively need to be released in the form of a belch. And that's why many people will have what I refer to as chronic belching, where they burp all the time. Okay, so that's so the next symptom on my list was belching, and then nausea and rib pain. So rib pain, you know, your hernia, your hiatal hernia is positioned just below your ribs. Okay, so and your diaphragm is attached to your ribs, and so you have a literal obstruction in your diaphragm. Okay, so that hiatus where your stomach is obstructed, it's always going to be tender, it's always going to be inflamed, and it's always going to be painful, because as your diaphragm moves up and down with every breath, it's taking that stomach with it, and it's causing that irritation. Not for everybody, it just depends on how your hernia is positioned and the size of it, but for many people with hiatal hernia, they experience pain at the rib cage, or just below the rib cage, right in here. Okay, all right, so let's move on to, I'm going to draw, yeah, just really quick. So I'm going to draw a picture of a healthy stomach. So this is what we want. We want the stomach hanging out down here below the diaphragm. This black line right here represents the lower esophageal sphincter, where the esophagus connects to the stomach. So this is what we want. We don't want anything wrapped around the stomach like it is when it's up here obstructed in the diaphragm, and we don't want any pressure on this valve. Okay, so then in the case with what I call a prehiatal hernia, Just draw this really quick. This is an example of your stomach just being pushed up against your diaphragm. Okay, and so now your lower esophageal sphincter is here. Okay, and this is your hiatus. So what you have to remember is, and then I'll draw one more. I'll draw let's see. Okay, one more down here, a hiatal hernia where the stomach then is now pushing all the way through the diaphragm. Okay, so what you have to keep in mind is up here in the chest cavity are the lungs and the heart. All right, so up here in the chest cavity you have the lungs and the heart. So so in this case where maybe your lower esophagus, your LES is not all the way up into the chest cavity, but directly above this is your heart. Okay, so you can have pressure on your lower esophageal sphincter here, and then up here where your stomach is pushing up into it's actually in the rib cage, your heart and your lungs are up there. So I hope you're beginning to see here how easy it would be for pressure to be on this little valve, the LES, when you have either a pre-hiatal hernia or a hiatal hernia. And all you have to do is think about a beach ball. I like to use this analogy. The valve on a beach ball, when you squeeze that little valve, it allows you to easily blow the air in, and then you let go and that traps the air in. Same thing, the LES, it's a one-way valve, right? It's supposed to clamp down tight, keep the contents in the stomach, but when there's pressure on it and it's not able to fully clamp down tight, then it becomes a two-way valve, right? Okay, so moving on to, I've got two more things. So these next two things are really, really important. So number one is the vagus nerve, and I've done entire videos on the vagus nerve. But basically, the vagus nerve, just going to draw it really quickly. So the vagus nerve, so here's your stomach. And this line coming down the stomach is the vagus nerve. And it actually begins in the brainstem, it comes down, and it innervates much, if not most, of our anatomy within the chest and the abdominal cavity. So the esophagus, the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, the liver, the spleen, it innervates, and that's just a fancy word that means it supplies nerve supply to those organs. And it branches out. So it's just not just a nerve, you know, so if you think of like roots of a tree and how they branch out. All right, so I'm just going to draw that on here. Right, so it branches out. So when you think of like radiating pain, it's because those nerves branch out and they radiate out to other parts of the body, okay? So when it comes to the vagus nerve, then all we have to do is think about, it's one of those things that's not talked about very often, and quite frankly, in my opinion, it's one of those things that doctors simply, it's just kind of a mystery. They don't know a whole lot about it, but all we have to do is think about other nerves that are more widely known about and talked about, such as sciatica, for example, or if you have a pinched nerve in your neck. So what happens, or carpal tunnel is a really great example. So we get inflammation, the nerves from that inflammation get pinched or pressure on them, and then what happens? Then we get pain, we get numbness, we get tingling, we get weakness, we get compromised function, right, in the hand because of a pinched nerve. All right, so now when we go back to the stomach, and by the way, remember our lower esophageal sphincter, here where the esophagus connects with the stomach. So the nerve comes all the way down. So now if we have pressure on the nerve here at the lower esophageal sphincter, that's a possibility. We can have pressure on the nerve because the stomach is pressed against the diaphragm. That's a possibility. We can have pressure on the nerve if you've ever heard of a torsion or a twisted or a folded stomach. Okay, imagine your stomach is twisted or folded or pressed up and folded against the diaphragm. We can begin to clearly see how this nerve could be pinched. Okay, and so then what can happen if we have a pinched nerve? I have a list of possible symptoms, several of them. So neck pain, difficulty swallowing. So all you have to do, guys, right now is you can go and you can Google. I'm not going to list the very, very long list of functions of the vagus nerve within the body. If you go and Google, just Google functions of the vagus nerve, and you will begin to clearly see why you're having some of the symptoms that you're having. Maybe you've gone to a doctor and they've done a bunch of tests and say, well, we can't figure out. We don't know. We don't know why you're having that symptom. You Google the functions of the vagus nerve within the body, and you will begin to clearly see why you're having some of these mystery symptoms. So neck pain, difficulty swallowing, lump in your throat, feeling full, delayed stomach emptying, back and shoulder pain. So again, the nerves radiate, okay? So if you have a pinched nerve in one place, you could have, pain and problems at the site, but that nerve is going to radiate out to the shoulders and the back and the neck and other locations. So you could have pain beyond the pinched nerve, right? Anxiety, panic attacks, heart palpitations. Have you ever felt like you're going to die? Have you ever woke up in the middle of the night and literally felt like you were going to die? It could simply be a pinched nerve due to your hiatal hernia. And again, we need to take away the hiatal hernia in order to take away the symptoms. And I have to say, I just want to give a really quick story about my mom, who's had a hiatal hernia, who knows how long, I believe a long time, been on proton pump inhibitors for many, many years, probably over 20 years. And again, I always have to give out a little disclaimer. I'm never here to promote going off of your PPIs cold turkey. Please do it under supervision of your doctor, especially if you have or suspect you have ulcers. But my mom has been able to, she's in the process of reversing her hiatal hernia. She's eliminated a lot of her symptoms. She's gotten off of her PPIs. It's taken her a long time. But she is reversing her hiatal hernia, and she's an example of someone who had actually a very large hiatal hernia. I usually tell potential customers who have a very large hiatal hernia that I really don't know if my course can help you. I believe that it can, but it's going to take time and commitment and dedication on your part to doing the exercises that I teach daily. Maybe making changes in your diet, making sure that you are optimizing gut health and gut bacteria, your microbiome, all of these things. But my mom is doing it, was able to do it. Like I said, she's gotten to the point where she's gotten off of her PPIs, and she tried to go off her proton pump inhibitors many times in the past, and she ended up in the ER as a result. So. But now she's off of them and she's doing really, really well. But heart palpitations, panic attacks, she had heart palpitations. That's what just made me think of her. She would get that heart racing in the middle of the night and other times. Headache, nausea, fainting. Both my kids, I believe, they have undiagnosed hiatal hernias, meaning they've never been diagnosed, but I believe they have hiatal hernias. My daughter used to have unexplained fainting, and she would go to the doctor and they would run tests and ask a bunch of questions and figure out what was causing, and they really didn't know. They just say, well, be more careful. Make sure you eat enough food, and my daughter eats plenty of food, but make sure you don't get stressed out. But I now realize that it's all connected. Even the fainting, again, if you go and you look up all of the different functions of the vagus nerve, you'll see why it would make perfect sense that a pinched vagus nerve could cause fainting. Reduced stomach acid and reduced stomach acid production. So one of the functions of the vagus nerve is to, again, communicate with the body. It's time to make lots of good strong stomach acid because we're eating food. It's really important that we have strong stomach acid because that's what sterilizes and helps us to fully digest and absorb nutrients, right, is through digestion of that food. And so when we don't have strong stomach acid, we set ourselves up for who knows what. I mean, if we have nutrient deficiency, we could set ourselves up for a whole host of different diseases. So it's really important that we have adequate stomach acid. And then the list goes on. I really want to move on to the final thing, which is the peritoneum, because when it comes to reversing your hiatal hernia with the exercise protocol that I teach, you must understand the peritoneum. So what it basically is a membrane or a mesentery that lines your abdominal cavity, but it also encapsulates all of the organs within the cavity, and it's what keeps everything in its place. It's mucousy, so it allows for things to kind of shift around without creating friction from that movement. But it's basically the attachments that keep everything in place, right? Did you ever wonder why, your intestines don't get all tangled up or whatever? It's because of this mesentery, this peritoneum. And so the reason it's so important to understand is because a lot of people they'll come across maybe a YouTube video that shows you how to move your stomach down, and they'll try it, and they'll experience pain, they'll experience increased symptoms, okay, and they'll decide that doesn't work for me, and they'll never try it again. And I don't blame you. That was my experience the first time I ever tried it. But what you have to understand, and you can Google a video of a hiatal hernia surgical repair, and you can actually see this peritoneum, so you get a better idea and look inside internally to know what I'm talking about. So it's a film, and it stretches and it moves, but the attachments can become, very attached. And so when we start to just aggressively force our stomach down, it can be, and that peritoneum kind of pulls, it can be painful. Not to mention if you go in aggressively and start to try to push your stomach down, just from poking around can be painful. If you go like this for 30 seconds, it's gonna hurt. So if you start really pushing your stomach down, that's gonna hurt too. And so that's why the protocol that I teach is how to move the stomach down gently and consistently. So the exercises are meant to be done gently, and they're meant to be done every day. So we start to get that movement, that stretching of the peritoneum. We start to get that stomach back down here under the diaphragm where it belongs. Okay, and then the body begins to create new attachments, right? In its new, home where it belongs, back where it originated. Okay, so I hope you found this helpful. That's session 1 of my course, Reversing Hiatal Hernia Naturally. Session 2 is called How Did I Get This Hernia? And it basically helps you to understand what caused your hernia. And I think there are 18 different things in that course that could be potential reasons why you have a hiatal hernia. And the reason that this is so important, and I think I did a whole video on this, I know that I did, on this topic, is because not only something caused your hiatal hernia. It didn't just jump up into your diaphragm. Something pushed it up, okay? Some of those things we have no control over them, but 14 out of the 18 we do have control over, all right? So it gives you a lot of power. And in most people, there's usually maybe 3, 4, or 5 different things that they are actually doing that's supporting that hernia, that's supporting it being stuck in the herniated position. And so then once you realize that you can make some changes in these different areas where you're supporting your hernia, so that instead of supporting that herniation, you actually support the movement of the stomach coming back down. So it's really, really important to understand and address what caused your hernia in the first place. And then the heart of my course are actually the exercise tutorials that I teach. So I have a 12-minute tutorial, I have a 24-minute tutorial, and I have a 5-minute tutorial. And these are the exercises that I developed and used to reverse my hiatal hernia. So that's it, guys. So if you want to learn more, obviously you can go to my website, pamfox.org, and I will put a learn more button down below this video when I'm done streaming. All right. Thank you so much for watching.